Malefic planets? That sounds extreme, Arlo. I can accept calling some planets challenging, but labeling them outright bad? Why?
By Jupiter's mighty thunder. Ella, these distinctions are central to classical astrology. Without understanding why a planet is labeled benefic or malefic, we lose a major interpretive lens in traditional practice.
But it feels like we're prejudging planets. Couldn't we start with them on equal footing and only call them difficult or easy based on context?
I see where you're coming from, but each planet's inherent nature, rooted in its elemental qualities, dictates whether it's deemed benefic or malefic in tradition.
You'll have to convince me. I'm not a fan of slapping negative labels on a planet from the get-go.
Challenge accepted, Ella. Stick with me, and you'll see why classical astrology takes this approach. Welcome back to our 6th episode of Learning Traditional Astrology. I'm Arlo, with 10 years of experience in the classical methods, and here with me are Ella, Clara, Cherry, and our newest addition, Katrina. Care to say hello, everyone?
Thanks, Arlo. I'm Ella. I've got a modern astrology background, but I'm trying to understand the traditional perspective.
I'm Clara, and I'm really excited to keep learning these foundational techniques with you all.
I'm Katrina, thrilled to explore the deeper layers of traditional astrology. It's all a bit new for me, but I love the mystery.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cherry, your robotic assistant, ready to optimize today's discussion.
Great. Today, we're building on last episode's discussion of planetary qualities. We'll classify the 7 traditional planets into the categories of benefic and malefic. So, here's a question. Why do you think life flourishes on Earth but not on other planets?
Well, we're at the right distance from the sun, so not too hot, not too cold. That balance allows life to exist.
Plus, there's water. Around 70% of Earth's surface is covered in it, which is crucial for survival.
Exactly. In traditional terms, Earth is relatively hot and moist, 2 qualities essential to sustain life. Now, consider the sun provides heat, the moon provides moisture. Clara, you picked up on that last time, right?
Yes, it made sense when you connected the sun to heat and the moon to moisture.
So what about the other planets, Arlo?
Let's recall the elemental qualities from the previous lesson. Katrina, would you mind reading them out?
Sure. Saturn is excessively cold and dry. Jupiter is moderately hot and moist. Mars is hot and excessively dry. The Sun is hot and dry, with heat dominant. Venus is moderately hot and moist, especially moist. Mercury can be dry or moist, and the Moon is moderately hot and moist.
Thanks, Katrina. As we said, the Sun offers heat and the Moon offers moisture, critical for life. So which other planets, given their nature, help support life on Earth?
I'd guess Jupiter, since it's moderately hot and moist. That sounds supportive.
What about Venus? She's also moderately hot and moist, maybe even more moist than hot.
Exactly. Jupiter and Venus have the right mix of heat and moisture, making them conducive to growth and nourishment. That's why we call them benefic.
Benefic. As in good? It seems too black and white to label them as good guys just because they're warm and damp.
It might sound simplistic, but their brightness in the night sky reinforces that notion. Visibility is a key concept in traditional astrology. Jupiter and Venus outshine most other celestial objects, suggesting a more life-affirming influence. We'll dive deeper into light and visibility in later episodes.
Huh. Well, I do admit they're beautiful to look at. Can't argue with that.
Right. So in essence, their temperate nature is beneficial, symbolizing prosperity and growth. Now, on the flip side we have the Malefics.
Saturn and Mars, right? But why are they considered malefic planets?
Clara, that's an excellent question. Let's unravel why Saturn and Mars are labeled malefics in classical astrology.
I still don't like the term malefic. Couldn't we just say these planets bring challenging energies instead of painting them as the bad guys from the start?
Ella, I get your reservations, but we need to understand that from the traditional perspective. It's about each planet's essential nature, not moral judgment.
From what I've read so far, Saturn's extreme cold is the opposite of life-giving heat, right? So it's considered malefic because it hinders growth.
Exactly, Katrina. Saturn's excessive cold is detrimental to life, and Mars's excessive dryness likewise works against the moisture essential for growth.
Still feels too black and white. Saturn is cold, Mars is dry, so we stamp them with a negative label. I'd rather see them as lessons to be learned.
Maybe they are lessons, Ella, but from a purely elemental standpoint, They're malefic because they actively oppose heat and moisture. Arlo, can we confirm that from a reputable source?
Yes, indeed. Cherry, let's bring Ptolemy into the conversation. Could you read his passage on Benefic and Malefic planets?
Certainly, Arlo. This is from the Tetrabiblos. Since the foregoing is the case, because 2 of the 4 humors are fertile and active, the hot and the moist, for all things are brought together and increased by them, and 2 are destructive and passive, the dry and the cold, through which all things, again, are separated and destroyed. The ancients accepted 2 of the planets, Jupiter and Venus, together with the Moon, as beneficent because of their temperate nature and because they abound in the hot and the moist, and Saturn and Mars as producing effects of the opposite nature, one because of his excessive cold and the other for his excessive dryness. The Sun and Mercury, however, they thought to have both powers, because they have a common nature, and to join their influences with those of the other planets, with whichever of them they are associated.
Alright, so Ptolemy basically divides them based on whether they foster growth or destroy it. Still, I'd argue that tough challenges can also lead to growth, just not in an obvious way.
I agree with you, Ella. But for now, the classical lens simply sees Jupiter and Venus as benefic and Saturn and Mars as malefic.
So, Jupiter and Venus are beneficial because they are moderately hot and moist, which supports life, while Saturn and Mars block or destroy it through dryness or coldness.
Exactly. The Sun and the Moon are benefics as well. Is that right, Arlo?
Yes, the luminaries are usually considered benefic. The Sun is the primary source of heat, though it can overshadow other planets if they're too close. The Moon is moderately hot and moist, again beneficial, though her phase and interactions can change her effect.
So it's not just a one-size-fits-all label. There are nuances. And Mercury, as I recall, is neutral?
Spot on. Mercury's nature changes depending on which planet it's closer to or in aspect with. It can act benefic in one situation, malefic in another, or remain neutral.
Mercury is definitely tricky. It's always shifting, just like its orbit.
Exactly, Katrina. But for the basics, Jupiter and Venus are benefic, Saturn and Mars are malefic, the Sun and Moon generally benefic with caveats, and Mercury sits in the middle.
Fine. I'll accept these old labels with a grain of salt, so long as we remember they're not moral judgments, just elemental frameworks.
That's the right attitude, Ella. Now that we've covered benefic and malefic classifications, let's shift gears. Our next topic is another essential layer in traditional astrology, the masculine and feminine planets. Next on our list is the classification of planets into masculine and feminine. Cherry, could you quote Ptolemy on this for us?
Certainly, Arlo. Ptolemy writes, "Again, since there are 2 primary kinds of natures, male and female, and of the forces already mentioned that of the moist is especially feminine, for as a general thing this element is present to a greater degree in all females, and the others rather in males. With good reason the view has been handed down to us that the Moon and Venus are feminine, because they share more largely in the moist, and that the Sun, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars are masculine, and Mercury common to both genders, inasmuch as he produces the dry and the moist alike."
So, the Moon and Venus are feminine due to their moist nature, while the Sun, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars are masculine?
By the blazing constellations. Exactly. Mercury is a special case, sometimes masculine, sometimes feminine.
I get that the Moon and Venus share more moisture, so they're labeled feminine. But isn't it a bit simplistic? Couldn't a planet just express different energies without being stuck as male or female?
We're not talking modern gender roles here, just elemental attributes. The Moon and Venus abound in moisture, so tradition groups them as feminine. The Sun, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars are drier or hotter, hence masculine.
So how does Mercury fit into this? Ptolemy calls it common to both genders. When does it lean masculine or feminine?
Cherry, read that section about morning and evening stars, please.
Ptolemy says, "They say too that the stars become masculine or feminine according to their aspects to the Sun, for when they are morning stars and precede the Sun they become masculine, and feminine when they are evening stars and follow the Sun."
Morning and evening stars, huh? I've heard of that, but I didn't realize it changed a planet's gender.
So if Mercury rises before the Sun, it's considered masculine, and if it sets after the Sun, it's feminine? That's so fluid.
Exactly, Katrina. Take this figure. The Sun is at 15 degrees of Aries. If Mercury is sitting at say, 25 degrees of Pisces, it'll rise in the east before the sun, making it a morning star and considered masculine. But if Mercury is at 5 degrees of Taurus, it'll set after the sun, so it's an evening star and deemed feminine. Because Mercury never wanders far from the sun, it can swing between these two states quite readily.
Got it. So one example is Charles Dickens's chart. Mercury rises before the sun. So that's a morning star, hence masculine, right?
Precisely. And that's not the only condition that can enhance or tone down a planet's masculine or feminine expression. Sign placement also matters. A masculine planet in a masculine sign becomes more potent in its masculine qualities, and a feminine planet in a feminine sign similarly grows stronger.
I'll admit, there's a certain elegance to it, though I'm still wary of labeling them male or female. But I'll roll with it for the sake of understanding.
Good to hear, Ella. The key is knowing these frameworks so we can apply them effectively. And with that, we move on to our next big classification in classical astrology.
Which is
Diurnal and nocturnal planets, of course. Let's move on to sect, how each planet is classified as diurnal or nocturnal. We've already learned how to determine a chart sect, but now let's see which planets belong to which side. Cherry, could you quote Ptolemy on this for us?
Certainly, Arlo. From the Tetrabiblos. Similarly, since of the two most obvious intervals of those which make up time, the day is more masculine because of its heat and active force, and night more feminine because of its moisture and its gift of rest, the tradition has consequently been handed down that the Moon and Venus are nocturnal, the Sun and Jupiter diurnal, and Mercury common as before, diurnal when it is a morning star and nocturnal as an evening star.
So basically, the Sun and Jupiter get labeled diurnal, and the Moon and Venus are nocturnal. Isn't that kind of obvious though? The Sun is definitely a day thing, and the Moon's presence is more associated with night.
By Jupiter's mighty thunder. Ella, don't dismiss it too quickly. This is the core of traditional astrology. Day is hot and active, perfectly aligning with the Sun and Jupiter. Night is cooler and more restful, hence the Moon and Venus.
right. So Mercury can flip between diurnal and nocturnal depending on whether it's a morning or evening star. That fits what we said about its gender expression too. Morning star Mercury being masculine and diurnal, evening star Mercury being feminine and nocturnal.
I'm still trying to grasp how it all ties together. So if Mercury rises before the sun, it's part of the day team, but if it follows the sun, it joins the night team?
Exactly, Katrina. That's why Mercury is the trickiest one. It can swing between both sects.
What about Saturn and Mars? They're not even mentioned in that Ptolemy quote. Where do they fall?
Cherry, can you read Ptolemy's next bit on Saturn and Mars?
Certainly. They also assign to each of the sects the two destructive stars, not however in this instance on the principle of similar natures, but of just the opposite, for when stars of the same kind are joined with those of the good temperament their beneficial influence is increased, but if dissimilar stars are associated with the destructive ones the greatest part of their injurious power is broken. Thus they assigned Saturn, which is cold, to the warmth of the day, and Mars, which is dry, to the moisture of the night, for in this way each of them attains good proportion through admixture and becomes a proper member of its sect, which provides moderation.
So Saturn, the cold planet, is put in the diurnal sect because day's heat tempers its chill, and Mars, which is excessively dry, goes to the nocturnal sect where moisture balances it out.
Huh, so basically they neutralize each other? It feels contradictory though. If you're far from the sun, like Saturn, shouldn't you be nocturnal? And if you're close to the sun, like Mars, shouldn't you be diurnal?
Ah, Ella, that's exactly why the ancients reasoned the opposite. They figured mixing opposites brings moderation, kind of like adding water to fire, or spice to a bland soup. That's the secret behind Saturn being diurnal and Mars being nocturnal.
So they are still malefic, but that little touch of balance can make them less destructive, right?
Yes, Katrina. It doesn't fully transform them into benefics, but it tempers their harshness. And that's crucial when interpreting a birth chart.
Alright, so the diurnal planets are the Sun, Jupiter and Saturn, while the nocturnal planets are the Moon, Venus, and Mars, and Mercury plays both sides depending on its phase.
Yes, and don't forget, the Sun and the Moon each serve as the sect light for their corresponding sect. Think of them as the leaders of the diurnal and nocturnal sect. Each sect also has one benefic and one malefic, neatly laid out for us. Isn't it beautiful how organized that is?
Got it. So, what's next?
Up next is the classification of inferior and superior planets. It's another piece of the traditional framework.
Let's hear it.
Now, for our final classification, inferior and superior planets. Cherry, please share what William Lilly wrote in Christian Astrology on this topic.
Certainly, Arlo. Lilly states, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, being placed above the orb of the Sun, are called the superior, ponderous and more weighty planets. Venus, Mercury, and Luna are called the inferior planets, being under the orb of the Sun.
Superior and inferior? That sounds awfully biased. Are we just ranking planets now?
By the blazing constellations. Ella, it's purely about position relative to the Sun in the geocentric model, not value judgments. The superior planets, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, lie outside the Sun's orbit, and the inferior planets, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon, lie inside it.
So this classification is just about which side of the Sun's sphere they occupy? That seems straightforward enough, but is there a practical reason for it?
Absolutely. This distinction helps us grasp the different synodic cycles, how planets appear to move when we track them with respect to the Sun.
Okay, so it's about vantage point, orbits, and apparent cycles, nothing to do with one planet being better than another.
Precisely. It's just an ancient way of noting which planets are beyond the Sun's orbit from Earth's perspective, and which are within it.
So, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars are superior. Venus, Mercury, and the Moon are inferior. Got it.
Perfect. This classification ties neatly with the other classifications: Benefic and Malefic, Diurnal and Nocturnal, masculine and feminine. All these concepts form the backbone of traditional astrology.
Fascinating. I see how each framework adds a layer to interpretation.
And that wraps up today's episode on the classification of the planets. If you're still catching up on previous concepts, check out our previous episodes on the nature of planets, the birth chart, traditional worldview, and more.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know what you think in the comments. We're always open to questions.
Bye, everyone.
End of transmission. Thank you for watching.